The 1930s confiscated grain, starved to death collective farmers, destroyed churches, exiled peasants, and joyful, optimistic Soviet cinema. In the 1930s, of course, no one could admit the failure of collectivization. On the contrary, the image of an ideal Soviet village was actively spreading. In his report to the 17th Party Congress on the work of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks on January 26 of 1934, after the peak of the rural famine, called Golodomor, Stalin only briefly mentioned that the pace of agricultural development was relatively weak compared to the huge successes of industrialization. The essence of the Soviet collective farm is a phenomenon that is inevitably broadcast, being dependent on vigorous public speeches broadcast over the radio and perhaps not even existing outside the radio air. Already in the resolution of the 15th Congress on Work in the Village of 1925, it was proposed to influence the village through the development of, quote, radio installations, cinema, strengthening the network of libraries, unquote. From the 1930s, central funding for the industry increased and centralization of management began. Responding to the socio-political agenda, cinema was to become a state-controlled mass standardized production, similar to factory production. In the early 1930s, the film industry established its own production of film, built large film enterprises, Mosfilm and Ukraine Film. As a result of the 16th Party Congress in 1930, Soyuz Kino was established, the first organization to control the problems of the industry throughout the USSR. It was later reorganized into the main directorate of the photo film industry under the USSR Council of People's Commissars. On the eve of 30s, in 1927-1928, the Central Committee of the Communist Party held a number of large party meetings on specific issues of ideological work: the party meeting on theater, the All-Union Party meeting on cinematography, and the meeting on agitation, propaganda and cultural development. The All-Union Party meeting on cinematography was particularly important for cinema. The meeting was attended by about 200 delegates and many guests. Quote, "Cinema, the most important of the arts," the decision of the meeting noted, "can and must occupy a great place in the cause of the Cultural Revolution as a means of broad educational work and communist propaganda, of organizing and educating the masses around the slogans and tasks of the party, of organizing their artistic education, expedient recreation, and entertainment." Developing Vladimir Lenin's idea of cinema as the most important of the arts, the meeting gave a detailed characterization of the advantages of cinema. Quote, "Cinema has a tremendous power of influence on the viewer. Cinema is the most portable, cheap, and extremely visual art. Cinema has the largest audience. Cinema, by its very nature, is the most mass and democratic art. Cinema, acting by display, is able to reach and influence the consciousness of the most culturally backward viewer. In terms of variety and richness of formal and technical techniques, cinema knows no rivals. The film, having once captured the performance of a frame, can be shown anywhere, giving the viewer examples of high artistry and brilliant technique." Unquote. But what more important for the theme of this video is following. The meeting formulated the tasks and outlined the main directions for the further development of Soviet cinematography. With regard to the socio-political content of films, the meeting put in the first place the task of educating the people on positive images, the tasks of popularizing by means of cinema the advanced progressive phenomena in a life, showing, quote, "new socialist elements in the economy, social relations, everyday life, human personality," unquote. This propaganda of the new must be combined with the struggle, quote, "against the vestiges of the old system," The meeting emphasized the need to develop all types and genres of cinematography, naturally putting the live-action film in the first place as the most widespread type of cinematographic art, and stressing the need for special attention to comedy film as the genre loved by the masses. The meeting dwelt specifically on those forms of cinematography which, according to traditions borrowed from capitalist film practice, had been neglected. From the Stalin's report at the 17th Congress of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, quote, "The new village stands out with its social and economic buildings, with its clubs, radio, cinemas, schools, libraries, and nurseries, with its tractors, harvesters, threshing machines, automobiles." In 1925, there were 3,700 cinema installations in the USSR. In 1930, there were 22,000, an increase of almost 6 times in 5 years, mainly due to the club and village networks. The growth of the latter is particularly indicative. In 1925, there were about 700 rural installations in the USSR. In 1930, on the contrary, there were about 14,000. More than half of the films about the village in the 1920s are retrospective. That is, they depict the old pre-revolutionary times in the village, predominantly centered on the pre-Soviet past, and all artistic means were aimed at forming the image of a dark and impoverished village. In the 1930s, the situation changes. Fewer and fewer films on village themes are retrospective. Most of the village films of this time were devoted to contemporary issues, collectivization, the struggle against the kulaks, and in the second half of the 1930s to the issues of collective farm construction, socialist competition, and the formation of a new way of life and new values. But generally, in the first half of the 1920s, the theme of revolution dominated Soviet cinema. A significant number of films were released covering the role of Vladimir Lenin in the events of the revolution, as well as a variety of subjects related to different stages of revolutionary events, not only the October Revolution, but also the First Russian Revolution. In the first half of the 1920s, most films were devoted to revolutionary themes. Among the most famous are Stachka, 1924, October, 1928, and Battleship Potemkin, 1925, all three of which were directed by Sergei Eisenstein. Grigory Alexandrov, another Soviet director, emphasizes in his memoirs that revolutionary themes represented the social demand of Soviet society. It is not surprising that there are recurring cliches that coincide with official rhetoric. The main strain of Soviet films about the village of this time, the 1930s, is that collective farmers are gaining vigorous labor victories, hampered by their secret enemies, kulaks pretending to be collective farmers. Prosperity and satiety are inherent to the kolkhoz, although in reality this was certainly not the case. Food is sometimes even thrown, as in the scene of eating dumplings in the film The Peasants from 1934 by FriedrichEmmler. The film tells about the struggle of peasants with kulaks for collective farms. All the main characters are peasants. The film clearly shows three main roles: the main negative hero, the kulak Gerasim Platonovich, his wife Varvara, who is an ardent and devoted collective farmer, and the head of the political department, Nikolai Mironovich. Varvara and Nikolai Mironovich are the main positive characters. They fight for the preservation of the collective farm and expose the kulak. The main characters are shown as faithful supporters of the ideas of communism and as hard-working peasants. Or 1934 film Happiness by A. Medvedkin, which features a Hollywood comic fight scene We throw in food at a rival. A collective farmer throws watermelons at thieves of collective farm property. Beautiful, powerful machinery becomes an attribute of the everyday life of the Soviet farmers, causes the light of the most advanced of them, helps to change their lives for the better, in which rest, fun, love and friendship, love of beauty and striving for perfection are necessarily present. In Airgrad by Dovzhenko, whole scenes are devoted to the Soviet aviation and fleet. Initially Dovzhenko had to shoot a comedy satirical film about the last Tsar of the Russian Empire, Nikolai II. But in the summer of 1933, at a thematic meeting, Dovzhenko informed his colleagues, declared that Tsar is not needed, we put it aside. We need to make a film about the Far East. Good, great, very interesting theme. The film is set in the Soviet Far East, near the Pacific Ocean, where a new city, Airgrad, is planned to be built. Japan tries to prevent the project by sending saboteurs, samurai. In the 1930s, Soviet-Japanese relations were tense and complex. An important factor in this period was Japan's expanding influence in East Asia and its desire to dominate the region. The borders between the Soviet Union and Japan were a source of enduring tensions, especially in the Manchuria region. Throughout the 1930s, multiple border incidents occurred, and Japan extended its influence during the Manchurian crisis of 1931, ultimately resulting in the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo. But back to the plot. Hunter Stepan Glushak, known as Tiger Death, pursues one of the saboteurs who shows his hostility to the Soviet order. Supporters of the old, still Tsarist regime, kulaks, superstitious and uneducated old believers, are hidden in the forest around. The kulaks are inextricably linked to the stupid, uneducated religious and pious rural life. The local priest gathers the people and preaches about the future demise of the Soviet order, and this time their fellow villager Aniki Shavanov returns from Manchuria. He tells how he lost his comrades. Someone was killed on the road as saboteurs, someone died from hard work in collective farms. At home Shavanov is angry that the Bolsheviks are laying the railways, allow themselves to sing in the taiga, and wear clothes that are not the norm. For example, he is incredibly indignant that women wear pants. In general, the characters of such films are collective farmers of unbelievable strength, who exceed twice the output norm. At the same time, nobody is interested in the fate of an ordinary farmer. They should keep silent about it. It happens that on the screen appear characters as if descended from the pages of Christian marvelous hagiographies, stories about lives of saints. In The Miracle Worker by Amid Vietkin, it is a young boy who enters the fire, saving collective farm calves, and does not burn. And of course, the main female character, the adolescent, talking to animals and miraculously pacifying their rampage. Positive traits are often described apathetically. The heroes are beyond self-interest, there is no greed in them, no rivalry, and their record-breaking performance on the fields put them beyond space and time. Sometimes successful collective farmers are also extremely talented and gifted in other spheres. For example, the comedies of the 30s by Grigory Alexandrov, Jolly Fellows of 1934 and Circus of 1936. The main characters in these films have a lot in common. In both films, the protagonist is shown as a simple, kind and sympathetic person who is always in a good mood. He is shown exclusively from a positive side, and he has no flaws at all. Against the background of other heroes, he stands out for his perfection, correctness, simplicity, good mood and talent. Besides, it is important, the main characters are collective farmers and workers, that is, representatives and participants of collectivization and industrialization. In film Jolly Fellows, it is Patechin who, on the one hand, is the chief shepherd in the collective farm, and on the other hand, he is incredibly talented singer and musician. In Circus, things are even more interesting. Marion Dixon, a popular white American circus artist, flees to USSR from USA with her black baby Jimmy because of terrible American racism. In USSR, she comes under the influence of Franz von Neitschitz, a menacing German theatrical agent who coerces Dixon into a romantic relationship and exploits her vulnerabilities through blackmail. During the performance, Neitschitz interrupts and threatens to expose Dixon's secret, that is, that she has black son, compelling her to leave Moscow with him. When she refuses, Neitschitz launches into a Hitleresque tirade, revealing Dixon's black son, Jimmy. However, the audience reacts with laughter. Ludwig, the circus director, informs Neitschitz that the people of the Soviet Union don't share his concerns about racial purity. The friendly Soviet crowd warmly embraces Dixon's black son. Despite Neitschitz's attempt to seize Jimmy, the audience unites to protect him. Barely Red Army soldiers in the crowd block Neitschitz, who, intimidated, retreats in fear. The climax unfolds as representatives of various Soviet ethnicities take turns singing a lullaby to the baby. The lyrics of the lullaby to Jimmy are sung in Russian, Ukrainian, Yiddish, Uzbek, and Georgian languages. A black American man in a Soviet naval uniform who has sat in the audience with his white Russian wife symbolizes the absence of racism in the Soviet Union. Dixon and Martynov, performance director in the circus, declare their love for one another. Martynov in this film also displayed all the values typically associated with an ideal Soviet man: romantic, always willing to defend the weak, having a stoic acceptance of pain, and possessing superhuman heroism and strength. That is an improved and evolved image of a positive Soviet man. People become like machines and machinery, which in turn are presented in an idealized, pathetic light with the efficiency of cosmic proportions. Planes with Soviet stars on their wings instantly cover colossal distances, demonstrating the power and boundlessness of Soviet power in its struggle. Tractors quickly plow vast fields. Spaces can be overcome not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality. Tractors and combines came to the village in the late 20s, early 30s, although in reality they were disastrously few against the background of those losses in horses and other living drought power, which the village suffered in the early 30s. Moreover, tractors cannot fully replace horses. Tractors cannot be conveniently used as a means of transport. It is interesting that in the collective farms at that time, a stratification appeared between the groups that monopolized administrative posts and worked with machinery and ordinary collective farmers working in the fields. Although the MTS, machine tractor station, became the center and basis of farm mechanization in the collective farms of the 1930s, the collective farms had to make large payments in kind to the MTS for their work. Even in more fertile agricultural areas, a kolkhoz with sufficient drought power might prefer to get by without MTS help because of its high cost. From the work by Conquest, The Harvest of Sorrow, Soviet Collectivization and the Terror-Famine, quote, "The state exacted grain deliveries from the farms not only in the form of compulsory deliveries, but also in the form of payments in kind made by the farms to the machine tractor stations for work done on their fields under a decree of 5th February 1933. This established that the MTS, machine tractor station, should receive 20% of the grain harvest in return for performing all the basic agricultural work on the fields of the kolkhoz. A decree of 25th June 1933 said that legal proceedings would be started against any kolkhoz trying to avoid these payments in kind to the MTS. Moreover, as Roy and Joris Medvedev put it, quote, charges of payments in kind for tractors, combines and other equipment were very high, while the prices the government paid to the kolkhoz were very low. Prices were in fact so low that they often did not cover even a fraction of the expenditure incurred in producing the crops. From another work, in the first half of the 1930s, the tractor and agricultural engineering industries received very high priority, and three major tractor factories, a combined harvester factory and a large machinery factory, were all completed in 1930-1933. But, as with all other industrial plants, the ambitious targets were not reached. Total tractor horsepower reached only 3.2 million by the end of 1933 and 8 million by the end of 1936, and as a result of the switch of tractor factories to military production, total tractor capacity available in agriculture rose only to 10.3 million horsepower by the end of 1940. While tractors were used for substantially more hours per year than in the United States, the level of mechanization remained much lower. In the cultivation of grain, 95% of threshing, 72% of ploughing, 57% of spring sowing, and 48% of harvesting were carried out mechanically in 1938. But other farm operations were far less mechanized, including the cultivation of row crops such as sunflower and sugar beet, and all operations with hay. And the most interesting, quote, for most of the 1930s, the level of mechanization was even inadequate to compensate for the loss of the drought power of work horses and oxen. In July 1928, total animal drought power amounted to 27 million horsepower, and the contribution of tractors to total drought power was insignificant. In the course of the next 5 years, animal drought power fell to a mere 16 million horsepower in July 1933, but tractor horsepower increased to only some 3.6–5.4 million in horse equivalent, depending on the measure used. Even by the end of 1938, combined tractors and animal horsepower had reached only 26–32 million horsepower. Moreover, tractors and horses had to undertake much of the transport within the village, and between the village and the state collection points and urban markets. The confrontation between the new technology, the tractor, and the outdated oxen is shown in the film The Earth by above-mentioned Davzhenko. Tractors are brought to the village, which Vasil promises to use against the kulaks. Arkhip, another peasant, who plows the land with oxen, looks down on the peasants whose work has stopped. But the collective farmers find an incredibly original way to revive the tractor. They urinate in the tractor's radiator tank, and the tractor starts working again. The most central shots of the film are devoted to the destruction of the mezha, border between land plots. Vasil, as promised, plows the boundary between collective and kulak land with his tractor. The film The Earth by Davzhenko is deeply poetic, sensual, even religious, saturated with shots of deep feelings and Ukrainian nature, and such action as filling the radiator of a tractor with urine by collective farmers can be really seen as a criticism of the Soviet system on a deep level, given that a tractor is one of the most important images of a collectivization and new orders in the village. The shots with the big oxen in the foreground and the tiny tractor in the background, the phone not working when the head of the kolkhoz called his superiors, may also indicate this deep, critical layer of the film. Film Old and New of 1929 by Sergei Eisenstein tells the story of a changing village. From beggarly and dark it becomes prosperous, an image of the old village where the hard work of peasants did not allow to escape poverty and life was hopeless. New comes to the village with cooperation. In the story, Marfa Lapkina, a horseless peasant, together with the district ergonomist and the poor people, organizes a dairy artel in the village. However, local kulaks actively resist collectivization. Not all poor people understand the meaning of comradeship and beggars' association. To the village's aid come worker chiefs who help the artel to get the first tractor. In the final scene, dozens of tractors are plowing the artel land. One of them is driven by Marfa Lapkina. It is characteristic that a woman's liberation was figuratively resolved through her mastering the profession of a tractor driver, that is, mastering technology. Marfa Lapkina opened the gallery of tractor driver heroines who filled Soviet screens in the 1930s. The issue of cleanliness and purity, visiting baths, cutting beards, is always emphasized. Well-groomed Komsomol members with stylish haircuts and hairstyles contrast with wild, hairy men, as for example in the above-mentioned airgrad. National attributes, such as Ukrainian vyshyvanki on the women workers in the field and humorous songs, are presented in an emphatically decorative manner. But the national feeling never acts as a motivation for the deeds of the positive heroes. Their values are again beyond nationality. At best, the lyricism of folk music justifies the presence of personal feelings against the background of social enthusiasm at work. Nationality is nothing to the Soviet collective farmer. It is simply beautiful. Moreover, it is the negative characters, such as the old believers from the film Airgrad, who define their actions by their desire to preserve traditional values, which are necessarily religiously obscurantist and absurd. Peasant women are ready to kill their children so that they do not come into contact with a world where women wear trousers and fields are plowed with tractors. As we can see, the plots of the films from this period are not full of difficult metaphysical questions. Directors of the 30s, shooting on the themes of collectivization, class struggle in the countryside, and mighty tractors, sometimes tried to express themselves and their creative impulse in cinema. But such attempts often ended tragically for their careers. Any difficult metaphysical problems, questions about the temporal and the internal, the profoundly individual and the collective, were not welcomed by the Soviet censorship and Stalin personally. For example, the already mentioned film The Earth by Dovzhenko, even after making the necessary cuts and 32 official and private testimonies, was removed from the show. The official reason was naturalism. By observing the rural landscapes, extensive shots, and the textured faces of the actors, the film about collectivization fades into the background, transforming into a poetic hymn that encapsulates the unwavering connection between the Ukrainian people and their land. Ethnologist Yuri Pukivsky wrote about the Earth, quote, "In his characteristic manner, Dovzhenko approached the topic with a philosophical scope. The director and screenwriter turned the image of the Earth into a metaphor for the national cosmos, the center and meaning of the existence of the Ukrainian peasant. In this harmonious cosmos, farmers lead a happy, timeless life, the peace of which is disturbed by the appearance of a tractor. In the film, Dovzhenko showed the severance of the organic and mystical connection with the land that collectivization caused." Unquote. It is a marvel, a poem of change and of permanence, of death and of a life, epic and lyric, tribal and revolutionary, passionate and imperturbable. As they carry Vasil in the coffin, the branches of the apple tree seem to say goodbye to him, lightly stroking his face. Another example of an attempt to introduce deeply poetic images and metaphysical questions into a film about class confrontation in the countryside is Eisenstein's unfinished Belgian medal. For Stalin's ideological propaganda, this plot was perfect. It is based on the real event happened in the small village of Gerasimovka in the northern Urals. Pioneer Pavlik Morozov is murdered by his own father for reporting to the village council about his father's criminal activities. Collusion with enemies of the collective farm. Pavlik Morozov's deed was approved by propaganda, and thus the myth of the heroic pioneer whistleblower, worthy of honor and respect, was established. The film Belgian Medal was met by critics very harshly. After viewing the film in raw cut, the main directorate of the film industry suspended filming and the footage was rejected. Eventually, the footage was accused of harmful formalism, which subsequently led to the banning of the entire film. May 13, 1937, after the last private screening of the footage by the Mosfilm Directorate, in the presence of censors appointed by the Central Committee of the party and other cultural figures, the release of the film was finally cancelled. Each official accusation, citing countless reasons, contained the main one. Eisenstein had fundamentally misinterpreted the tragedy of Pavlik Morozov, placing him within the framework of a biblical allegory. Instead of focusing on the actual socio-political issue of the class struggle during the collectivization period, the film's plot revolves around the inner conflict between father and son. This conflict is presented in archetypal and religious traditions, in creating the lone scene before the final, where the father kills the young hero. The director was actually inspired by the motif of Isaac's sacrifice from the book of Genesis. In the fight scene, the bodies of the fighting men take the form of a cross, and in the final scene, Stepok, the name of the protagonist, the boy killed by his father, is resurrected like Jesus Christ. As Eisenstein wrote in his diary, the actor's poses were meant to convey the Virgin Mary's grief over the dead body of Christ in the Pieta. Pieta is the scene of lamentation of Christ, thus creating a frantic effect for the entire composition. The script notes for this episode indicate that when Stepok is to perish, the motif of the Pieta occurs. In the scene where Stepok dies, the character's face is frontally portrayed and the angle of view is wide, an arrangement that in art and, in particular, in iconography was used to depict theophany, reinforcing the scene of transcendence. Weizmann collected all the arguments against the film and placed them in his article, The Gabble of the Gods, which was published in the newspaper Soviet Art on May 5, 1937. Quote, "The class struggle is only the external thing that pits the father against Stepok. The voice of blood kinship sounds stronger in the film than the voice of consciousness. The boy in the film is a victim already doomed to be slaughtered. Stepok walks around the collective farm as a meek and young boy, as an innocent child, whose doom has long been foreseen and written in the Book of Destinies. Stepok is a stranger, enlightened by the premonition of his doom. Already wrapped in the wings of death, he is not like his fellow peers. He is important and solemn. He is prophetically rhetorical, and around his forehead shines a martyr's halo, still given to him by the director during his lifetime. Life is governed by the eternal laws of bloody retribution, and Stepok's murder is carried out in the setting of religious mystery. Night still reigns over the world, evil still good, and in small clearing among the shining ears, a symbol of growth, a father kills his son. Above them is chaos. They are primitive people, and Stepok's pioneer tie in the film is anachronism, a side of an accidental future, perhaps accidentally intruding into the mystery. Sacrificial blood has already been spilled in the clearing, and Stepok, agonizing, looks not like a pioneer, but like Isaac, sacrificed by his father Abraham. Stepok, bleeding, is only a short, spinning around the meadow, a biblical boy, and the clouds of smoke are already rising to the sky from the sacrificial fire. And in the collective farm field, the biblical oak tree stands alone and solemnly as a symbol of eternity and its immutable laws.